And I mentioned this before, I apologize for my voice. I'm drinking some tea to try to keep my voice as good as possible during this. I would like to first acknowledge that we are on the territory of the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc people who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. We acknowledge the painful history of the genocide and their forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. And now I will introduce you to this evening's speakers, Professor Nathan Brown and Professor Shibley Tahimi. Professor Brown is a professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington Columbian School of College of Arts and Sciences. In 2013 to 15, Dr. Brown was the president of the Middle East Studies Association, which is the academic association for scholars studying the region. Dr. Brown was president of the Middle East Studies Association, and he serves on the board of trustees of the American University in Cairo and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has previously served as an advisor for the committee drafting the Palestinian Constitution, USAID, the United Nations Development Program, and several NGOs. Welcome, Professor Brown. Professor Tahimi is the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's written several books. One, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on Middle East in 2003. And his most recent book is The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East. Professor Tahimi is a recipient of the Excellence in Public Service Award, awarded by the University System of Maryland Board of Regents and the University of Maryland's Honors College 2014 Outstanding Faculty Award. Professor Brown and Professor Tahimi are 2 of the 4 authors of the article, Israel's One-State Reality, It's Time to Give Up on the Two-State Solution, in the May-June issue of Foreign Affairs, which is more fully laid out in their book, a collection of essays, The One-State Reality, What is Israel-Palestine? And that information will be dropped into the chat. It will also be said to you in the follow-up email with the recording. I highly recommend the book and the article. The webinar will start with Professor Brown and Professor Tahimi addressing some questions about what they and their authors have discovered about Israel-Palestine that led them to conclude that Israel-Palestine is today one state. And then they'll talk about our country, the United States' role in that situation. And there'll be opportunity for the professors to answer your questions, and then we will have closing statements. As everyone here is aware, many people have very strong feelings, understandings, and beliefs and experiences about this evening's subject. Some grossly divergent ideas about the truth and the reality of this situation. Truth is a tricky subject. People can have honestly different perceptions of the same situations. And sometimes we've been taught things, we've heard things that are simply not true. Tonight is not a form of debate of what is true, but an opportunity to explore what this evening's speakers have learned. First, I would like to ask Professor Brown if you can talk a little bit about how you got into studying this subject, what your interest is, how that happened. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us. And it looks like we've got a large size group. So there's obviously a lot of interest in this topic. And the interest is in the topic, presumably, not so much in us personally. So I'll try to be brief when I talk about myself. But what I would say is the subject here is Israel and Palestine, and I took two separate journeys, and can't separate them anymore. As far as Israel goes, I'm Jewish, and I'm part of a generation that grew up kind of, one of my earliest memories is the '67 war. Israel was just, underdog, fun place, surprise victory. And so it's a place I visited a couple times, and it's a place that I just felt a connection to. But when I went into studying the Middle East, I stayed away from it. I stayed away from Palestine. I just thought this is a subject that's so heated. Nobody wants to hear what academics have to say. Everybody's mind is already made up. I'll go study other things in other places. Then when the Oslo Accords were signed, I thought, what I've been studying in the Arab world have been what looked like maybe boring topics, why they built the legal systems they work, how a bill becomes a law in Egypt and how Kuwaiti elections are run. And these are really sort of questions about state building. I thought, well, the Palestinians are doing that right now. I don't have to go through archives. I can actually talk to people. Why are you writing the school curriculum the way that you are? How did you decide how to adopt rules of parliamentary procedure and so on? So I was there in the late 90s, researching Palestinian politics almost as if this was a place in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and just happened to be next to Israel, but really sort of trying to understand Palestinian politics in their own terms. And I left right before the eruption of the Second Intifada. And that really kind of shook me, because while I was there, Palestinians were telling me the situation is intolerable, it's going to explode any moment. And I remember just thinking, they don't realize this conflict is over, it's resolved, it's just a matter of drawing borders. And I was wrong, and I learned a lesson there. Listen to the people you're studying. And when I started listening, I started hearing things that didn't quite fit into my preconceptions. So, and I began to realize that you can't really talk about Palestinian politics without talking about Israel. You couldn't talk about Israel without talking about Palestine. So what had been very, very separate journeys kind of came together in a single road.
Great. Thank you very much. Professor Tellamy, would you like to talk a little bit about how this project came about?
Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting me. And it's always a pleasure also to join my colleague Nathan for this. So, a lot of people think that we just put this article together to exploit something that is happening. It happened to be an incredibly timely article. But in fact, the project has been ongoing for 4 years. And many of you who know something about academics know how long these projects take, particularly when you're trying to get it published in a university press book like this. The book came out with Cornell University, the type of review process. And then when you also, not only 4 of you doing this, but you bring in 12 other people from the region as well as the US. So this has been a journey anyway. When we started it, the arguments that we're now putting in the public discourse were really rare, and they were there. We were not the first people to put this on the table. There were scholars like Jan Lustig who had written a very important article and then a book on this issue. But it wasn't really something that the public was, even scholars, certainly the policy world was not accepting. By the time we actually put the book out, a lot has changed. So when we finally published the book, and it only came out a month ago in March with Cornell University Press, we wanted also to write an article that would also update it a little bit and be more somewhat policy oriented as well as descriptive. And we contacted Foreign Affairs to see if they would be interested. We sent them the introduction, and they engaged and said, if you put something together, we'll look at it. Now, many of us, in fact, maybe all 4 of us, have written in Foreign Affairs in the past. So this was not, Foreign Affairs were not strange to us as scholars. This is a journal that we had published in. And I wouldn't say that they treated this any differently from any other. Our basic, we authored it. Of course, all 4 of us had to come together and converge. But since we had worked on the book, we were already there. It was really quite a bit of refinement, but not much more than that. And foreign affairs dealt with it professionally like they dealt with any other issue. We didn't really, I wouldn't say it was treated like any differently from any articles that we have had the experience to deal with it. And they saw it, the timeline was exactly what they had anticipated in the beginning. So this was a process that was not unusual in any shape or form. Obviously, the fact that the argument came in foreign affairs, because in a lot of circles, it still is not an argument that had taken hold. It seems surprising because it's a mainstream journal, obviously. But honestly, the arguments that we make, and we'll talk about them later, we're not so foreign by now to scholars, and particularly scholars in our field. In fact, we could one of our co-authors, Mark Lynch, and I do a poll we call the Middle East Scholar Barometer among scholars who focus on the Middle East. And basically, for the past couple of years, what we've been finding is that they're more or less describing reality as we are describing it in the article and the book.
Cool. Well, some good news. We're starting off with some good news. Great. Okay, so I'm going to ask both of you this next question. To split, we're talking about over there now, and I'd like you to please describe the current situation as one state, as you and the other authors reveal in your article and your book. Professor Brown, your chapter is about a thorough insinuation of the one-state reality into Palestinian political life. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate upon that, and perhaps one of you can also talk about certainly Israeli government controls countless aspects of Palestinian lives. So I don't know how you would, I'd like to split that up, but I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
I can start with a specific chapter and then sort of hand it over to Shibley to talk about the broader reality or set of realities. What I would say is that what I noticed, this was with a co-author, Emmanuel Banna, who's Palestinian American. We talked, it was, I'll put it sort of in long-term historical perspective. You take a look, there's a Palestinian national movement that arose in the 20th century. And it took all kinds of different forms, but it was usually about, really centered on the idea there should be a Palestinian state in all of Palestine, part of Palestine. It should be an Islamic state. It should be a secular state. It should be a democratic state. But it was really centered around statehood. And again, when the Oslo Accords were signed, the way that the Palestinian leadership presented it to the people was, we're building a state. We have to make compromises, but we're building a state. And that doesn't seem to be true anymore. When I hear conversations among Palestinians, it's not about how we're going to build our state. It's how we're going to cope with Israel, how we can cope with occupation, how we're going to move things in a different direction. It's not about some kind of distant vision of the future. It's how do we make things better today, and what tactics? The Palestinians talk an awful lot about. We lost our national strategy, so that's really sort of what they talk. The starting point is that there is this reality of Israel that controls their lives, and if you want to, if you're a Palestinian, and the question is, what school do you go to? What airport can you use? What road can you drive on? Where can you travel? What can you do? The answer has to start with, how does the state of Israel see you? And then the rest follows. So they're coping with that. They're trying to find ways to, as I say, to manage it, to resist it, and so on. But that's really kind of the starting point for most Palestinian lives.
I cannot hear you.
I'm sorry, I muted myself. I have emails coming in, making noises. Sorry. Thank you very much, Professor Brown. And Professor Tahami, can you talk a little bit more about the Israeli control over Palestinian lives and how that is exhibited as one state? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, we really need to first make a little something very clear. So all four of us come at it from having been supporters of two states. We supported what came out of Oslo, even if we had reservations about the terms, but we probably supported two states, all four of us, long before Oslo, because we thought that was the way to go, and we probably stuck with it as long as we could. And honestly, if somebody were to offer a genuine two-state solution tomorrow, where there would be an independent, sovereign Palestinian state side by side with Israel, we'd advise the Israelis and Palestinians to take it. So, people have to understand, we're not coming at it as quote opponent in principle of two states. We're just saying it hasn't happened. It's been more than a half a century. Occupation is temporary. People have been saying, basing their assumptions about the temporary situation as they saw it, and I set that in quotation mark, based on the assumption that it's on the way. It hasn't happened for most of a century, and there's no end in sight, and there's no path to getting there. So what we're identifying is, again, a one-state reality, not a one-state solution. A lot of people have confused this, thinking that we're advancing this as a solution. No, if it's a solution, it's a horrible one. I mean, it's an unjust and unsustainable reality. It's a strategically, unbalanced reality, in addition to being morally abhorrent reality. So it is we're basically recognizing what exists, not thinking about it as a solution. We could talk about that a little bit later on. But when you look at this one-state reality and the degree of control, you are looking at it through, we're asking people essentially to stop thinking that there is a pre-1967 Israel, which is a flawed democracy, but nonetheless, not any worse than many countries around the world, with structural discrimination against minority, temporarily occupying territories, and those territories, the occupation will come to an end, and everything will be fine. Then obviously it's a different kind of setting. You look at it with a little bit more patience, and certainly pre-1967 Israel is not an apartheid state. It had flaws in the system, but it isn't that. But if you switch and you look at the entire state that Israel controls from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean as a single state, and you look at it as a tiered system, where non-Jews have different degrees of rights, so that non-Jews who are citizens of the state have most rights, but not all, with structural discrimination on one end. And then you go through different gradations from residents in Jerusalem, most of whom are not citizens, who have more rights than people in the West Bank. In the West Bank, you have areas A and B and C through the Oslo process, and then you go to Gaza. And then you look at that structure of domination, where even though you have autonomy in some sections, degrees of autonomy, let's say by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank or Hamas in Gaza, nonetheless, the ultimate control of borders, airspace, even property rights. If Israel decides that the structure needs to be destroyed, they'll destroy it. If Israel decides that somebody needs to be taken into custody, they'll take that person into custody. So when you look at it that way, and you look particularly at the disparity of rights between most Palestinians in that one state and Israeli citizens, and certainly Jewish Israeli citizens, it's hard not to use the term apartheid. And we describe that directly in terms of whether it is apartheid or something like apartheid. The word shouldn't matter as much, because no matter how you look at it, it is certainly as bad.
Right. And there's one judicial system actually that is controlled by Israel for Israelis and Palestinians. And even years ago, when I was in the old city of Jerusalem, and I got a map of Israel and the West Bank, the whole thing was was Israel. They didn't differentiate in the tourist maps between the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Israel. So thank you very much. That was helpful. There's a chapter in your book called Beyond Oslo, Reimagining Israeli-Palestinian Futures. Can you talk a little about the guiding assumptions, options, scenarios, reflections, recommendations, and steps forward, which is how you have that in your book, and offer some thoughts? I know that this would this could be the subject of an entire webinar by itself to talk about that, but could you talk about that? Thank you.
Let me try and start. Shibley's a better editor, so he may remember the chapter and exactly what it says much better than I do. But what I'll do is I'll answer as of today, because I might view things a little bit differently. But I'll start from what Shibley says. We're not advocating a one-state solution. We're not opposed to it. Authentic two-state solution. It seems to, there are viable and just two-state solutions. We're not advocating a solution. This is not, there's a tendency, I think, when talking about the future, especially both of us are, creatures of Washington, to really sort of focus on diplomatic processes, what's going to be done, what Israeli negotiators said at the last round, what Palestinian negotiators said. There was a statement you used to hear all the time in Washington: the solution is no, and it's just a matter of signing and actually getting there, or finding the right modality, getting people back to Camp David, getting people to Taba, getting people to this location or that location. And I think what we're trying to do, the book has a lot of different authors, so different authors would probably answer the question different ways. In the Foreign Affairs article, we're writing it, we wrote it at the beginning of this year, and we're trying to look forward, and we're not trying to prescribe any ideal outcome. We're trying to say, okay, there are things that can be done now to move things in the right direction, and to make, you really have to start not with imagining a perfect world and then figure out how to get there. You have to start by taking the world that it exists as it exists today, and look at a situation where, we came face to face with the term apartheid, and how do you begin to chip away, make life livable, increase rights for those people who have been deprived rights, allow people to move, allow people the kind of freedom that they need. And some of the authors in the book itself sort of talk about, there's one chapter which really talks about how it is that, for instance, national movements come to envision territory and what can change that. So you're really talking, when you talk at that level, about, I think, long-term generational changes, ideological changes, social changes, demographic changes. You're not talking about a 6-month process by which two identifiable groups of leaders will come to a solution. So that I think what we're trying to do is to move the conversation back to current realities, but also broader, beyond a simple diplomatic a set of questions that you need specific answers to.
If I may add to that, the four of us obviously are the ones who authored the Foreign Affairs article. We also authored the introduction and conclusion to that book, and we also have substantive chapters. We all have substantive chapters in the book as well. But there are a dozen other scholars that we invited who are really talented, brilliant. Actually, some of the art, I learned a lot from this group of people. It's not just we obviously own the article. And that article was also informed by all of our contributors. It's not like they're in a way present, even though we were the ones who were taking responsibility for the words that we wrote. But in that book, as Nathan suggested, and I urge people to read it, because the brief moments that he and I used to describe the control doesn't do any justice whatsoever to that control. We have some extraordinary chapters. I mean, there is a professor Alberto of the Hebrew University who talks about mobility regimes as a method of control. And the description and the analysis of the scheme of control through controlling mobility is extraordinary. I mean, you learn a lot of the details. You understand how the mechanisms work. We have, Diana Greenwald, who has a chapter about how there is this subcontracting of control to different entities that gives the image that there are entities, but in fact, it's all serving the same purpose of control. And in the chapters that you referred to, Pat, there were a couple of chapters, one by Khalid El-Gindi, who had written a book on U.S. policy toward Israel-Palestine, and by Tamara Wittes and Kevin Haggard, who wrote a piece about the implications of a one-state reality for American foreign policy. Now, what we had asked these scholars to do was not really to prescribe. We didn't ask them to say, what should the U.S. do? We asked them, what is the likely implication? How would policymakers likely absorb this shift of reality? And what then would be the possibilities before them? In our work, particularly in the article, what we sought to do, as Nathan pointed out, of course, is not to put out a particular solution because we don't offer one. And we actually think the United States shouldn't even try right now. But we did say something that provides a starting point and an important starting point. And that is, number one, that the United States is an enabler of this bad reality. That is, we often don't understand the extent to which the United States has played a role in the entrenchment of this unjust reality. And we enumerate various things that explain why our own policy has been responsible for the reality that now looks like apartheid, including, shielding settlements, one of the biggest obstacles to progress at the international organizations over and over and over and over again. And without that, it's in our opinion, I don't think that we would have had the expansion of settlements that we've had over the years. This is not something new. It is administration after administration. And so there are lots of things that the U.S. has done. And to the extent that the U.S. has done those things and still is doing those things, even as we speak, we are complicit in this unjust reality. And our point number one, as Americans, all four of us are speaking as American scholars, we don't want our country to be complicit in a reality as we describe it that is similar to apartheid. We don't want the U.S. Morally or strategically to be complicit and enabler of that. So part of the recommendations that we put on there have to do with how we can divorce ourselves from the entrenchment of that reality and stop being part of the problem, start being part of the solution. So it isn't that we're providing the solution, it is that taking ourselves out of being part of the problem.
Great. So there's one more question, and that would be a great segue to the next part of this, which is focusing on the role of the United States in this. But before we move there, I would like to know if you addressed, I didn't read the whole book, so I didn't see this, but I'm curious. Right now, many Palestinian villages have had all their land stolen, their water stolen, almost all of them. Their wells are dry because the Israeli settlements have pumps that grab the water, suck the water up from the aquifers, so they don't have access to that. It seems to me that there's going to be a just solution, that there needs to be some way to get, is there a way for Palestinians to get any of their land back, state or no state? And the flip side of that is, with this new government, they're talking about they're on this wild building spree, annexing land, building hotels on East Jerusalem. And so they're going as high speed into, looks like, swallowing up the rest of the available land, say in the area C. Can you describe if there's any hope for moving that in a more just way?
I'm going to have to rely on Shibley to give hope, at least for the short term, because I can't. No, I mean, I think that reality has been going on for some time, and that's one of the main factors that led lots of people, not just us, to say, hey, this is, after 56 years of this, maybe it's time to start saying this doesn't look temporary anymore. But the degree to which it is entrenched just is increasingly entrenched is just striking. I mean, and you talked about land and water. Shibley actually earlier mentioned mobility. I mean, the fact is, Gaza is separated from the West Bank. When I was doing work on this research full time, I was living there in 1999, 2000. Jerusalem was connected in economic terms, in intellectual terms, in social terms with the West Bank. It's now cut off. It's just it's very difficult to get from one place to another. Shibley was talking about mobility regimes. I mean, Oslo divided up, for supposedly a temporary period, the West Bank into these various zones, zone A, B, and C. And I remember this was 4 years ago, 5 years ago was the last time I was there, 4 years ago, being in a refugee camp north of Ramallah, which was Area A, and Ramallah is Area A. And they told me in the previous week, somebody had electrocuted themselves. I mean, they were in the street, and they were lying in the street. They had to call police to come write up the report, and an ambulance, the body. It took all day, because in order to get from Ramallah to this refugee camp, they were both Area A, but you had to go through Area B. That was a situation even before. So the massive building spree that you're talking about, and it's not just building; it has to do with roads and so on. And a government that is really, I mean, it's a coalition, but there are people within the coalition and powerful voices that see this as a golden opportunity to really sort of drive a nail in any possibilities of territorial compromise. You asked if there is hope, and I'm just making things worse. But I think for the short term, as long as this government is in power, things are going to get worse.
Right. And actually, thank you so much. I misasked that question. We're trying to pursue truth here. And in fact, what I wish I had asked, but what you answered anyway, is what do you see in the near future? What looks like it's happening? Like, really, my heart, of course, wants some hope, but more than that, I want the truth. And it looks like the truth is we're racing toward ever worse situation. So thank you for answering that. All right, so moving over to the United States. We'll ask a few questions here, and then we will get to the Q&A. Let's see. Professor Tahami, you wrote about the Arab and American divisions or dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, state politics, and public views. So those of us who've learned about the situation from mainstream media have heard of this sort of more from the Israeli Jewish perspective. So I thought it was interesting that you wrote this chapter sort of about the Arab perspective or the Palestinian perspective. Can you explain a little bit about that?
No, I did not actually write it about a perspective. This article was more about the Arab context and the American context. So the idea here was, we tried to kind of provide a different context, an Israeli context, Palestinian context, and broader Arab world context and American context of the one-state reality and how it is likely to impact those debates. So in the chapter, basically, I took the changes that are happening in the Arab world and asked the question whether there's a profound change that has now kind of accepted that the status quo as it exists in Israel-Palestine. Obviously, we've had the Abraham Accords, for example. Those Abraham Accords bypass the Palestinian issue altogether. And the Biden administration is trying to even broaden them without demanding an end to occupation at the same time. So have Arabs really shifted? Because they used to insist on a land for peace. That is, you can't make peace with the Arab states unless you withdraw from the occupied territories in 1967. That was the Arab peace plan. Well, the Abraham Accords did not demand that. They were making peace and with Israel without demanding that. And so what we analyze what I analyze in that particular chapter is how this came about, and also whether, in fact, there has been a simultaneous shift in Arab public opinion, whether the publics have now come to accept the status quo. Now, what I argue, at least based as a student of public opinion in the Arab world, and having done many years of polling in public opinion in the Arab world, I don't find any shift in Arab public opinion that is discernible. There is, of course, social media debates. A lot of it is instigated by governments and elites, but there is no obvious shift that we see. I think the Arab world, of course, is distracted from Israel-Palestine for a lot of reasons, particularly since the Arab uprisings. People have their own, burdens at home that they have to deal with, and so Palestine is not really high on their agenda. But they haven't shifted their attachment to Palestine. It's still part of their identity, and it could be ignited at various stages or built into the grievances that they have vis-a-vis their governments. So we don't see that as a shift taking place at the public level. And with regard to the Arab government shift, in many ways, it's not a particularly new shift. It is that Arab governments have all governments that have made peace with Israel, beginning with the Egyptian government back in the late 70s. I wrote a book on the Camp David Accords. Those agreements were first and foremost agreements with the United States. All Arab rulers, their aim was to improve relations with the US, to gain brownies from the US, to gain strategic assets from the US. So Israel was just a beneficiary of the Arab world trying to gain the favor with the US. And that's what happened with the Abraham Accords. And that's why we say, as Americans, in a way, the idea that our country, our government, would say, I'm going to try to normalize the relations between this one state unjust reality and the rest of the Arab world without demanding an end to this injustice is unacceptable. And we say that in the article. And so that is something that is very peculiar. But what I also show in the chapter on American politics is that there has been a shift in public opinion, and particularly among Democrats, who have become far more forceful in wanting a more even-handed approach. And in fact, in my own polling, as in Pew polling, as well as in Gallup polling, we found the most recent Gallup poll showed that most Democrats sympathize with the Palestinians more than they sympathize with the Israelis for the first time in their years of polling. So there is a shift taking place at the grassroots level among Democrats, but it hasn't really been elevated to the level of elected officials yet. And so, but there is a dynamism taking place in the discourse at the level of the public, certainly among Democrats, not among Republicans so much.
Right. For those of us who don't know much about the polling, all we had to do was see some clips of the World Cup and how the sort of almost the main theme of that was solidarity with the Palestinian people, to see how the people are so different from their governments, in that they do still support at least those who are at the World Cup. Professor Brown, would you like to add to that, or should I go on to the next question here?
Why don't you go on?
Okay, great. So now we're really in the United States. I have a series of questions about the United States. Can either of you please describe how our government has both supported and undermined the very two-state solution that they say they've been working toward, and has spent so much money and so much of our Secretary of State's time trying to work toward?
Well, this is actually something we haven't talked about. So let me start, and you might get a completely different answer from Shibley. I don't know. Who's been following this process actually probably for longer than I have. But what I would say is there are all sorts of criticisms. The Israelis were never serious. This was all really Oslo was really just an excuse for annexation. The Palestinians never meant to make peace. The Americans didn't really understand. My own perception is that I understand why people come to those conclusions about each other, but I think there was a moment in the 1990s when there really was a peace process, and the idea of a process was that you would get some kind of negotiation going that would build momentum and trust would build. And that happened for a couple years, and it ran out for all kinds of reasons. And in the article and in the book, we're not really about assessing blame. You did that wrong, you did that wrong, and so on. So we don't go into it that much. So what I'll give you now is just my personal view, and there's plenty of people to criticize. But if we focus on the United States, I think there were a couple mistakes that were made. Number one, there was a gross power imbalance. And we treated this sometimes as if there were just two equal sides, but it wasn't just two equal sides. There was always, I just think, a greater American capacity to understand things from the Israeli point of view. And it didn't necessarily mean that they were pro-Israeli. Sometimes it did. It meant that they got Israeli politics, they got Israeli demands, they understood Israeli electoral politics, Israeli public opinions, and they tended to treat Palestinians as if it was Yasser Arafat and a few people around him. And the second thing is, when you mentioned the thing about, the United States pushing a two-state solution, the first president to use Palestine as a proper noun was George Bush, the younger. My favorite example here is Hillary Clinton, when she was first lady, mentioned the goal of a Palestinian state. And White House spokesman said the next day, she does not speak for the White House. I mean, she was living in the White House, but she didn't speak for it, right? So the United States, it may have been that some officials understood this as a process that might lead to a two-state, but they were holding out the idea of a two-state solution almost as a reward for the Palestinians. Things like that tended to increase mistrust rather than trust. So I don't want to take anything away from the American negotiators and diplomats in terms of their intentions. I think they did want a negotiated, peaceful solution. I think they came to understand the issues probably a little bit better over time. But I think one thing that they did, for instance, was the Oslo Accords really have no dispute settlement mechanism. I mean, so what Shibley just said, Arab states that wanted to make peace with Israel did so because they wanted a relationship with the United States. So all roads led to Washington. And that meant Israel, as a stronger party, could impose things unilaterally. The Palestinians would complain, and they go to the United States, they'd say that's a violation of the agreement, or that's a violation of international law, and the United States would, we need to take this to the United Nations, and the United States would say, oh, don't take that to the United Nations, they'll just muck things up. Oh, international law, don't get the lawyers involved, we can talk this out. And the result was one that was ultimately very, very corrosive to the process. Again, all sorts of things went wrong. There's all kinds of blame to go around, but I would say that those were some of the things the United States did not really face up to what a two-state solution would look like until after it was too late.
Okay. I want to combine two questions and then do a third, because I see we have 23 comments in the chat. I don't know how many of those are questions. So the next two questions I'm going to combine, and then there's one more, is to describe the resistance among U.S. public and within our government to understanding the reality on the ground? What is the resistance about? Can you explain why that resistance to an actual sovereign Palestinian state or actual rights for the Palestinian, why that resistance has been to accepting the reality has been perhaps not only unproductive or counterproductive, but perhaps dangerous or damaging?
Well, I think, first of all, with regard to policymakers, it is rare that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a high priority for an administration. And therefore, the easiest thing for them to do is to just try to keep the status quo. And so most administrations, certainly this one, coming after the Trump administration, with a lot of things on its agenda, they basically assumed that this was going to be a crisis management affairs. They're not going to, they're right in the sense that a solution isn't really likely anytime now, and they can spend a lot of time on it, and a solution would not happen given the kind of Israeli government you have, given Palestinian politics, given how much they would have to do at home, and they have a crowded agenda and leverage to use on other issues, from domestic issues to the Ukraine issue to other issues internationally. So that's one reason why this usually does not, get a lot of attention. But there is something more about the presuppositions, and that is that American political elites have basically concluded that they want to support Israel both as a democratic state and a Jewish state, and they can't, they don't. No one is going to say, I want to support a democratic state that is not Jewish, and no one is going to say, I'm going to support a Jewish state that's not democratic. And so, because of that kind of framing, the only way really for them to resolve it intellectually for themselves is to keep the prospect of two states alive, because there is no way an apartheid-like state is going to be considered to be a democratic state. And if there is a one state with full equality, that's no longer a Jewish state, which, by the way, the American public, according to our public opinion polls, if the choice is between a Jewish state that's not democratic or a democratic state that's not Jewish, 2/3 of Americans would prefer a democratic state that's not Jewish over a Jewish state that's not democratic, including a majority of Republicans. But that's not where the political elites are. They're not prepared to make that kind of trade-off question. So therefore, it's hard to kill the two states. It's a psychological solution for a problem. And moreover, it is a crutch. Now, I don't say that they use it necessarily deliberately, but it's easy to use. You go on an automatic pilot where you can justify not doing something by saying, no, we're going to preserve the situation for the two-state solution. And it becomes a smokescreen that diverts attention from the existing reality as we know it. And that's one reason why we say, don't invoke, one of the first recommendations, we say, stop invoking the two-state solution. Even if you think it might be possible in the distant future, we actually don't theoretically preclude it in some distant future. It's not possible in any foreseeable future. In the lifetimes of Palestinians that are now living in those conditions. And so stop using it as a smokescreen. That's one of the things that we start with. And I think, but it's hard. It's very hard for politicians to get that up.
Can I just add something very quickly here? And I'd be interested in Shibley's reaction. He's probably better connected at more senior levels than I am. But when I first started making this sort of one-state reality argument, it was at this point probably late I mean, I'm trying to think, it was 2007, 2008, 2009. And I started making it not because I was brilliant, but just because I was listening to Israelis and Palestinians who said two-state solution's over. And that's the reality that we're living in. So when I would talk to people there, and I would mention two-state solution, they would look at me quizzically, like, "Wait, that's last decade." But in American official circles, I would get very quizzical reactions. Now I don't think that's the case. You close the door, and they'll just look and say, "Well, you're right." They don't know what to do about it, or what they do about it is just too politically unpalatable to the confront. Or sometimes, actually, and I would say this with the Trump administration, they were happy about it. But there isn't, I don't think there's the same kind of denial of reality. What there is just a despair about being able to do anything about it, at least anytime soon.
Well, I agree with that, by the way. And as you know, I think that not only that, but we all four of us know people in the administration who have told us privately that it's a one-state reality, especially before they went into the administration. And so I don't think that is, and yet, of course, they're publicly making statements about the two-state solution. So that's not surprising. But what I wonder, though, in this particular case of American foreign policy, is the role of the president himself. Because there is no question that this is an issue that would not move anywhere without a president. This is too politically complicated in American politics without a decision on that. And the signaling on this issue is coming from the president. And whether or not the president has come to grips with that or not, I don't know. Whether he's still living in the 1980s and, or 90s when he was a senator, or whether, it's hard to know. And I would dare say that despite all of the structural, constraints on any president that we all know about, and our complicated political process and congressional politics, presidents make a difference. And I think that look at how much Trump was able to do going against the grain in a time when that was not a priority issue at all. He made it a priority issue, put a lot of muscle behind it, and got it done the way he wanted to get it done, obviously in a way that was detrimental in the long term. But nonetheless, a president can do a lot. And I would dare say if had Bernie Sanders gotten elected instead of Biden, I don't think Bernie Sanders would have gone to the UN and shielded Israel from repercussions of building settlements as this president had done just last month. So I think it's hard to know the extent to which the president himself here is a different place from the rest.
Right. Well, it's hard to, a lot of the people here work with members of Congress, and we try to see how we can shift our members of Congress to do the right thing here. And clearly, Biden has been a big disappointment. I mean, he said he would, I think, he would end the Abraham Accords, but he's trying to expand them. I think he said that he would move the embassy back, and that's not going anywhere. And
no, I talked to someone from. It was about the consulate. He said he would reopen the consulate in East Jerusalem.
Right.
Yeah, he didn't do
and
that.
Then, thank you. And then I was talking to someone. I wonder where there's a very sort of pro-Israel, somewhat liberal organization that I think has a fair amount of power. And I was talking to an aide in an office who was supporting Biden's position and explaining why they didn't sign the Sanders-Bowman letter, for instance. And he said that negotiations had to happen sort of behind the door. And I said, really? I said, well, how's that worked for you so far? And he said, great. We were successful with President Biden last week. I said, really? I could use some good news. Tell me how you were successful with President Biden. And he said that President Biden had agreed to postpone the vote for the change of the balance of power with the judiciary. And I say he did that in exchange for to give Gavir a militia in order that he can use against the Palestinians. And the person I talked to, who takes, I think, his orders from the liberal two-state group in this country, that's as far as they go. So in terms of how we can move, where we can gain some access to move people forward is difficult here. Well, that's this very last question, because I think it's important in terms of working with Congress, and then almost the rest of the time to closing statements can be for people from who have been writing their questions in. As you described, the U.S. government bears a lot of responsibility for the current situation in Israel and Palestine. If we were to stop enabling the Israeli military to stop arming them, giving them weapons, if we were to stop protecting them at the United Nations, if we were to stop passing laws in this country that punish people who tell the truth about Israel and Palestine, if we were to stop some of those things, can you envision what might happen next? Because that's the question that a lot of people, members of Congress and others who are afraid to do the right thing, they're fearful what might happen next. So can you tell us what you think might happen next? And then we'll move on to the questions from the participants.
It's your turn or my turn? I lost
Whoever
track.
has a thought. If you don't,
Well, we did. Yeah, go ahead.
I will try, but then I'm depending on you to probably give a fuller answer. I mean, what I would say is, I don't know what would happen long term. I do think that if the United States simply took the step of standing out of the way, there's a resolution at the United Nations, there's an attempt to go to the International Criminal Court. There is an attempt to convene the contracted parties to the Geneva Conventions and that sort of thing. That would communicate a message very, very quickly to the Israeli leadership. There is a price for continuing on this path. I don't think it would lead to a sudden earthquake and a sudden solution, but I think it would begin to address the power imbalance. And it is not one that would fundamentally threaten the state of Israel. The state of Israel is an accepted state. They have a seat in the United Nations. They're recognized by most countries. This is not going to put the state of Israel out of existence. This is not an existential threat. It may be a threat to their current policies, and this is one that effectively the United States is insulating them from. So it might make Israeli politicians realize that there is a price to the path that they are continuing, and it might have some repercussions.
Yeah, and if I may add, I mean, I agree with that, and I think that just to note that in our foreign affairs, in the book we actually refrain from making policy recommendations, and by the way, we also have refrained both in foreign affairs and in the book from blaming both sides or each side, the Israelis and Palestinians, so much, because that was not really we were just look at the reality as it is and focus on the role of the U.S. as Americans. And therefore, by saying the U.S. is enabling, we're not saying that the Israelis and Palestinians are not also responsible for a lot of things that have happened along the way. That should be clear. A lot of people misunderstand that. We just avoided that for a good reason. That was not something that would have been helpful in this process. But we do make specific recommendations for policy, and not because we think they're going to lead to a solution, but as Nathan suggested, they're likely to show that there are consequences for certain actions, and they lay down certain standards of what the U.S. will accept or not accept. Certainly, one of them is we should stop saying that we have shared values if, in fact, we agree that this is an apartheid-like reality that now exists. What shared values do we have with that? Start telling the American people the truth. why should there be an unbreakable bond when you have a reality that is apartheid-like, a one-state reality? How could that be the case? We need to first change the discourse. We need to change the discourse, tell the American people the truth about what exists. Second, we all agree that one of the most important things that the U.S. can do, and relatively easily, is stop protecting things like settlements or other breaches of international law at international organizations. I mean, that is something that shouldn't be hard to do. It doesn't require congressional support. It requires the U.S. not doing something. It's not doing something that the U.S. is actually proactively doing and expending energy and leverage with other states to persuade them to do it. So that alone would be huge. We do suggest conditioning aid on steps that Israel would take to end its military control. While we don't provide a solution, our view is that we shouldn't tolerate any outcome that doesn't have equality for Jews and Arabs, for everyone in that state, Jews, Arabs, and others in that state. And therefore, we call on demanding equality, even if we don't have a political outcome. There are obviously both two states, one state with full equality, or a confederation. All these kind of arrangements could possibly indicate an outcome that might be equitable, but we should insist on equity now. We can't accept this reality that now exists. And finally, you had mentioned something about those people who are courageous enough to call out structural discrimination. Yes, we think the U.S. should stop delegitimizing people who have done that and start protecting them and defending them. It's a huge mistake that it is almost hard to believe that our own government that is projecting a liberal order and wanting to defend human rights and democracy is not defending human rights activists who are courageously calling structural discrimination, whether they're Israelis or Palestinians or Americans or internationals. That is a mistake. And those sort of things have to stop, and they can be done.
Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to pass this over to Noble Larson, who's been gathering lots of questions, and it's going to be filling those. And I will see you all back at 8:20 when we reconvene for some final statements. So, okay, Noble, take it away.
Okay, very good. We have a lot of good questions and a number of statements that are interesting, but they're not questions. So I recommend that folks check the chat for those. Along the lines of the questions, Elsa Arbach has asked, what has the response to your article been within the diplomatic community and from foreign policy colleagues? And maybe you could both comment, maybe briefly on that, since we're kind of running short.
Why don't you go first?
Well, I mean, obviously we're all four of us in the policy community in the Washington D.C. area, and we have all had played roles in policy. So we have a lot of policy colleagues. I've advised several administrations over my career, Republican and Democrat, and I think that we all have connections with people in the policy community. Not surprisingly, a lot of the comments that we've gotten privately have been extremely supportive. Of people who said, "I'm glad this is being said," or "I agree with you," including people who had served in high-level positions in administrations, and including some people from Congress. So we have gotten a lot of support. We have gotten also some people who said, we agree with your assessment about what now exists, but we don't agree about your prescriptions. We think that we should do it differently, or two-state is not really dead. So we get that a lot. We expected the storm from a lot of people who are on the right, and we're getting those in terms of people who are, calling us names, or people who are not even reading the article carefully, just looking at some things to pick up to delegitimize the arguments. So there's legitimate criticism, as always. I mean, we had to work together on this. It's been a journey. We've been mostly in harmony, but we go back and forth on some things that could be done. These are not simple issues for anybody to grapple with. So there are legitimate people who disagree with us legitimately, and I understand and respect them. But there are also those who are out there just to prevent you from having that voice that you have.
That handles it well enough. I don't need to add.
Okay, I will move on to another question. Laura Gibney has asked, will the rapprochement between the Arab states and Syria and Iran have any pertinence on Palestine and Israel going forward? Which might be somewhat of an essay question, but either of you want to take a try at that?
I'll give a very short response, not a full essay. Shibley's the international relations scholar, so he might be able to give the essay. I focus more on domestic developments, but what I would say is one interesting thing is, there will, of course, be some kind of effects of regional dynamics, but one trend of the last, I would really say, even couple decades, is a little bit of a disconnect between sort of regional diplomacy and especially at the state level, and the Palestinian issue. It's not that people in the region do not care about Palestine or Palestinians, as Shibley said, but governmental relations are really focusing on other things, and an awful lot of the regimes in the region just don't want to have to deal with it. So I wouldn't expect the repercussions to be fundamental in the way that may have, a generation ago, when there was realignment in the Arab world, that may have had deep effects on Palestinians. Much less so now, at least at the governmental level.
Okay, well, thank you. Mike Hager has asked, how important is the inability of Israelis to govern themselves as a democracy played in all of this, as we've seen with the issues of the High Court and everything over there?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's be realistic. The entrenchment of the one-state reality as we have it is really not connected to the recent developments in Israel, including the sudden rise into power of the far right that has already been developing in Israeli society for a while. With or without Netanyahu being in government right now, I don't think the structure of the situation, that is the one-state reality as we've described it, is really dependent. And those people who think if we could just get these people out of office and get a different bunch of people in office, we're going to have some transformation in the structure. That's not true. It's not going to happen. Having said that, I think it is really important what is happening in Israel. I don't dismiss it. It's very important. Obviously, for Israelis within the 67 border is extremely important, because this is a challenge even to a Jewish democracy, the way they've seen it, the way it's being defined, and these judicial changes could entrench a far-right Israeli government for years to come, and even reshape the Supreme Court. And so it's important for them. But the real question, of course, is whether that has generated this energy, what people think is the awakening of the liberals, and it is. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who've been going to the streets in a sustained fashion for weeks. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. Whether in fact that will then translate into something that could move Israelis toward ending the control of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And there are voices, we know, including the voices actually in our book. I've referred to Professor Berta from the Hebrew University. She's become a voice in the demonstrations. She's out there pitching the connection between how the occupation has corrupted Israel's internal democracy as well. So there are voices that are creating that change. Whether or not this will happen, I'm a little skeptical. And I'm skeptical because of the entrenchment of this reality with no outside consequences. That's number one. And I'm skeptical because the numbers among Jews are still not in favor of the liberals, even though the liberals are energized. What we've seen in the societal transformation in the Jewish sector in Israel is that it has moved more and more and more and more to the right, so that the far right, yes, they may be relatively small, they're now in government. On some issues, you've got a lot more people supporting them, including the possibility of expelling Palestinians, where polls showed that there is a larger group of people that backs that option. So the liberals are going to have to find a path if they're going to be effective even within pre-1967 Israel. And there is no way they can find a path unless they figure out a way to join with the 20% of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. If they keep marginalizing them and think they're going to chip away at the right wing in Israel and gain a majority, it's never going to happen. And I think that unless they can build a coalition and then also build some hope in the relationship with Palestinians under occupation, I think, they may win the round, meaning maybe Netanyahu will not, do the reforms, but with or without the reforms, the status quo is awful. So even if the liberals win by not having the reforms take place, which obviously would make things even worse, the kind of concessions that were made to the far right, the fact that you have Ben-Gvir as the national security minister with his own militia, the fact that the same trends are still in Israel, that just doesn't lead to much hope.
Okay, well, there have been a number of good questions that I think you've already answered. So during your previous discussions, but Jeff Klein asked the following: what do Palestinians want? Polls show declining support for two states. Does this reflect an affirmative choice or a recognition that present Israeli policy and settlements seem to make it impossible?
I'll give you sort of the squishy, touchy-feely answer. Shibley's a pollster, so he can probably give you the numbers. But this is just what I hear when I talk to Palestinians. It's probably a little bit more of the second, but it's essentially conversations has moved beyond what kind of ideal state do you want. Conversations are much more, as I said earlier, about what to do now, what kind of resistance, peaceful resistance, armed resistance, how is it that we, what about doing a march to a checkpoint? There's a lot of interest among Palestinians in sort of international solidarity activity. I would say, especially in the last few months, there seems to be a marked increase of interest in what I would call attacks on Israelis from outside the factions, the traditional factions, the Hamas and Fatah, just, a local group that calls themselves, that affiliates with this group called the Lion's Den or something like that. Whether that's a flash in the pan or not, I don't know. But so the discussions, if you ask Palestinians, what kind of state would you ultimately like to see, you will get an answer. I'd like to see a one state or two states no longer an option, or two state is the only, but that's not, those aren't the discussions they're having so much among themselves. It's really just, I think, a realization that set in over the last generation that this is a situation that is going to, that might evolve in more favorable directions, but it's not going to be resolved anytime soon.
So let me just add to that a little bit, which is, I know that this question is always posed in a very odd way, because if you are a Palestinian and you're given any options which you're going to be equal, if say tomorrow I'm going to offer you 2 full states, sovereign states that are going to be at peace with each other, would you take it? Yes, they will take it. Majority of Palestinians will take it tomorrow. I'm going to offer you 1 state in which you're going to be fully equal with Jews. Yes, most Palestinians will take it tomorrow. I'm going to offer you a confederation in which you're going to be fully equal. I suspect that if they understand what it is, because I don't think that people can, have developed an understanding what confederation is, and theoretically would do it. So it's not really about what would they take. It is, you can't disconnect them from what they think is possible. So, you cannot. I mean, basically, when you've given up hope that you're going to get anything that in terms of equal rights, whether it's going to be in 1 state or 2 states or however, then you start looking at options of how you can resist. Think about it in terms of anyone who has been under occupation for all their lives, which is pretty much what most Palestinians are enduring, right? They are under daily humiliation for 56 years, and there's no end in sight. And they're raising kids who are looking at the same future and maybe even worse, particularly as this far-right Israeli government. So the question is not about believing that something's going to be offered to you. The question is, what could you do to alleviate it? In fact, what method of resisting can you have to create more freedom for yourself? And so that's where the conversation is.
Well, I think we're probably at the end of the allotted time for questions. Pat, is that the case?
If there's another question, you could take one more.
Well, I can take one more. It's actually kind of a statement, but I think I'll turn it into a question. It was about the Palestinians that are the refugees that are in the diaspora. What role might they play in this whole process of a 1-state reality?
That's an excellent question, and the question is going to be better than I think either of our answers, because in a sense, one thing that the Oslo process did was sort of marginalize them. And they weren't really that strong actors. They were a factor in the negotiations. Will there be some kind of right of return or compensation for refugees? But they weren't really represented. And in some ways, I think that situation has gotten worse for them when the discussion is so much about what's going on in the West Bank, about the siege of Gaza, which we haven't talked about, but just a really draconian set of measures against Gaza. Again, Palestinians outside of Palestine, the ones who, and especially those who do not have citizenship, you just got an enormous number of stateless people, and their issues have been postponed. And not only that, the body that really forcefully advocated for them, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as a result of the Oslo Accords, relocated to Ramallah and is now basically just a shell of itself. So they don't have structures, they don't have people pressing them. It's still, if you talk to Palestinians, the issue of refugees, right of return, still has a very, very strong emotional pull, but it's not tethered to any kind of political movement or structures.
Okay.
Okay, well, I think that's fine. Thank you very much, both of you.
Right. Makes sense. And I actually want to add just briefly to the point before that about resistance. And I've spent a lot of time over in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and in Israel also. What I've heard from Palestinians and Israelis, all of whom are trying to end the occupation, is that resistance has to come from the outside. Many Israelis have said to me, we understand Americans want to help Jews, but why are they helping this corrupt government that is committing war crimes? Why don't they help us? They're so powerful that it's really hard for us Israelis, part of this, who want our government to not be criminal and commit these crimes against the Palestinians. It's really hard for us when the biggest country in the world, most powerful country in the world, supports our government. And I've heard that from lots of other people. So we have our country has been such a huge enabler, as both of you have said. It's really therefore our responsibility to act to, as you have also said, stop enabling this from happening. And so what this is about is what this webinar, the purpose of the webinar is to help us figure out how can we do that. But that's a lead into, I'm going to ask each of you to give some closing words, and then I'll give some, and we'll end there. So who of you would like to go first? Who would like to go first?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting us. Really appreciate it. I can speak, I think, on this one for all four of us, that we really are not trying to do this as a form of activism. We're coming at it as analysts, as scholars. And one reason why we didn't really get into kind of the history of blaming parties was that too. We basically wanted to, we actually started this project, honestly, with a question, not with an answer. What is Israel-Palestine? We didn't start with the answer being it's a one-state reality. And many of us went in there probing that, suspecting it might be, but we went in there, with an open mind and learning from each other, and got to this point. And so it is hard to not focus on our government, A, because we're for Americans, and B, because of the role that is historic. People say, there are a lot of unjust things going around the world. Why why focus on this one? Well, there is no other place where as much of an enabler of the reality. And if in fact we're right, and we think obviously we are, that it is already a one-state reality akin to apartheid, that reality is beyond just liberalism. We need to take a look at it, and I think our government should take a look at the role that it plays in enabling this reality.
Thank you.
I'll end on sort of a similar note, but I'm going to try and inject some optimism as well, because I haven't so far. Like Shibley, just thank you for listening to us. And in a sense, that's part of the optimism. I mean, Shibley mentioned earlier, as we talked about the response that our article had provoked, and we put this volume together. It was not a trouble to get a bunch of smart and accomplished people to talk about this. And so one change that is, in my mind, positive is just the range of debates and ideas that are out there in public debates in the United States is widening tremendously. I mean, that's a positive thing. So yes, Shibley and I are both academics, first, foremost, and first and last, I should say. That's what we are. We try to understand the world and hope that good people change it. But even listening to this and protecting the space for a broader range of ideas is just absolutely critical, especially at this time when there's a realization that the old ideas have worn out. And the other thing I will say is another note of optimism I have is a little bit generational. And I say that more in the United States and a little bit more for Palestinian. Israeli society, I've got some personal ties to, but I don't have as good of a sense. But younger generations just think of these issues in very different ways. When I go into a classroom, the kinds of discussions, the kinds of questions that I get asked by my students are very different from the ones that I got asked before. When I talk to younger Palestinians, there's sort of a sense that, the politics of the older generation failed. They're looking for answers. So there's an inquisitiveness and I think an openness to new ideas that is encouraging. I don't think the situation is going to be resolved anytime soon. I'm not even sure it's going to get better anytime soon. But I do think as long as there are sort of people of goodwill and open minds, that the possibilities for things ultimately leading in a more positive direction are very much there. And that's why I thank you for listening.
Thank you. All right, I have a few closing words also here. In some ways, this conversation is about truth and the importance of truth. First of all, you talked about your academics. Most of the people, I'm guessing here, are very familiar with Norman Finkelstein and Steve Walt and John Mersheimer, all of who paid very heavy prices. Norman Finkelstein the most probably, and there are countless other examples historically and very recently of academics who have been fired because they dared to speak the truth about this. Many people have died, have been killed, both Palestinians and Israelis, in the battle to live on this land that we are talking about. And each life is precious, regardless of the person's race, religion, nationality, or age. And so we come to that from that perspective. Today is the anniversary of when an Israeli soldier murdered Shireen Abu Akleh, a beloved Palestinian American journalist. There has been no government investigation, not by the Israelis, not by the US. Initially, the Israeli government lied and said that Palestinians shot Shireen, but CNN, Al Jazeera, and other media, and she was, of course, one of their own, investigated and determined that she was shot by an IDF soldier. Since they announced this, no Israeli official has denied this, and no one has been held responsible. The FBI said they would investigate, but today it's been a year, and there has been no report. And that's just one small example of the lies. And even when the lies have been exposed, nothing happens. I think we're in deep trouble in our country and on this planet. And it's in part because of the lies told, then believed, passed on as lies, and then used to make bad and oftentimes destructive decisions. And I think it's impossible for any of us to discern every lie from every truth. But we at MAPA, our speakers here, and presumably people who've attended this to hear the truth be spoken, are trying to do our part for listening to, discerning, and speaking the truth. We at MAPA provide opportunities for people like you to speak the truth. And even sometimes we are attacked and lose donors and friends as a result. Sometimes this is also be rewarding, such as when people whose narratives have been attacked and silenced are affirmed. So I thank all of you for traveling this at times difficult path with us, and hope that together, as our numbers grow, we will help our government and our businesses and all our decision makers, all our friends and family and ourselves, help create a healthier planet for everyone. I invite you to join us on May 31st for our next webinar on this subject, the politics of Israel-Palestine in the US. The speakers will be Laura Friedman, who wrote one of your chapters, and Michael Aria, I'm not sure how you say that, but he's a correspondent for Mondo Weiss. Thank you again so much, Professor Brown and Professor Tahami. Thank you, Cole Harrison, for managing all the technical issues, in addition to participating in our working group and being the executive director of MAPA. Thank you for Noble Larson for managing the questions, for the help of Susan Nicholson and Abby, and Eva Mosley and Claire Sheridan and the others who are here today. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I wish you all, wherever you may be, a good afternoon, a good evening, and a good night.